Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the McGowan Theater located in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. I'm Doug Swanson, Visitor Services Manager for the National Archives Museum, and I'm also producer for the Noontime Lecture Series. Before we begin today's event, I'd like to remind you of a couple other programs that will be taking place in this location in the near future. To celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, Leonard Davis will be on hand on Wednesday, July 29th to discuss his book, Enabling Acts, The Hidden History of How the Americans with Disabilities Act Gave the Largest U.S. Minority Its Rights. Then on Saturday, August 15th at 2 p.m., we'll present a special film screening of the Jimmy Stewart comedy, Harvey. To find out more about these and our other programs and our exhibits, please take one of our monthly event calendars, which you'll find in the racks in the theater lobby, or you can visit our website at www.archives.gov/calendar. Our topic for today is the Creole Affair, the slave rebellion that led the U.S. and Great Britain to the brink of war by Arthur T. Downey. Arthur Downey has at various times in his eclectic career been a lawyer, an officer in two major corporations, a diplomat, and a former staff member of the National Security Council. For a dozen years, he taught international law at Georgetown University Law Center. In 2011, his book, Civil War Lawyers, Constitutional Questions, Courtroom Dramas, and the Men Behind Them, was published. His current book, The Creole Affair, was published late last year, and he is currently in the final stages of completing his next book dealing with the Cold War, which will be published this September. Please join me in welcoming Arthur T. Downey to the National Archives.
Good afternoon. For most of us, American history begins with the American Revolution and the drafting of the Constitution, then perhaps makes a brief stop at the War of 1812, and then we rush on to the Civil War. And as a result, that period in between is sort of a black hole. However, in that period, in that black hole, there took place the most successful slave revolt in American history, one that led the United States and the British to the brink of their third war. I want to tell you that story. It's a very interesting story. On October 25th, 1841, the brig, the Creole, left the dock in Richmond, Virginia, with tobacco, supplies, and crew and others. Captain Ensor was in charge. He had brought his wife, his 4-year-old daughter, and his 15-year-old niece with him. He had a crew of 8 and 3 guests passengers who got free passage to New Orleans in exchange for being guards. The Creole sailed down the river to the Atlantic Ocean. In addition to tobacco and supplies, the Creole also carried human cargo. It had 135 slaves on board. The males were in the forward hold at night, and the 1/3 of the slaves that were females were in the aft hold. They weren't chained. This is not the image of those horrible slave ships coming from Africa a generation earlier. The cook for the slaves was a young slave whose name was Madison Washington. Remember that name, we'll see him again. On the night of November 7th, the Creole was about 200 miles northeast of Miami. It was nighttime. The ship hove to, which meant it basically stopped. It was dark except for one lantern in the front, in the bow. And all of a sudden, Madison Washington jumps out of the female aft hold. Another slave jumps with him. The other slave had a pistol. One of the guards tried to stop him. The other slave and other slaves stabbed him more than 20 times, virtually decapitated him, threw him overboard. They then went after the captain, Captain Ensor, stabbed him repeatedly, left him almost for dead. There were 19 slaves that led the rebellion on the Creole that night. Those slaves then came back to the captain's quarters, opened up all their trunks, got dressed up, ate, broke into the brandy cabin, and drank and had a wonderful time. Madison Washington wanted the crew to sail to Liberia. One of the guards, however, said that he used to be a mate and knew how to navigate. And he said, "You can't get to Liberia from here. We don't have enough food or water. But in exchange for my life, I can navigate us to the Bahamas, to Nassau." Madison Washington said, "Okay, that's fine." On November 9th, the Creole entered the mouth of the channel in Nassau, about a mile from the city itself. A Bahamian pilot came on board to pilot the ship into the harbor, and he looked around and told the slaves, "Hey, we have no slavery here. You guys are free." On the north side of the harbor was Hog Island. Today, we know it if you watch television and see the ads. This is the Atlantis Resort on Paradise Island. It's huge development. It wasn't then. Then the harbor master came for routine inspection. The first mate, his name was Gifford, jumped on board the harbor master's ship and said, "Take me into the city. I've got to see the American consular officer because we've just had murders on board our ship." On board the ship, you can imagine the emotions that crackled within everybody. Those 19 slaves who led the revolt certainly had earned their freedom, and they must have felt especially satisfied. But they were probably also worried that the British might jail them, or worse, return them to the United States. The passengers and crew, needless to say, were terrified, but hoped that their nightmare was nearly over. Freeze that picture in your mind, and let's step back and look at the United States at that time, the economy, the politics of it, the president, the Congress. Let's look at US and British relationships, and let's look at what the Bahamas was like then. First, the United States. It was a lot smaller than it is today. There were only 26 stars in the American flag. The United States population was at about 17 million, including more than 2 million slaves, about half the size of Great Britain at the time. The economy in the 1830s boomed. Railroads and canals and steamboats moved people and goods all over the country. The best example is that in 1829, when Andrew Jackson came to be sworn in as president, he came in a horse-drawn carriage from Tennessee. In 1837, after his presidency, when he returned to Tennessee, he returned on a train pulled by a steam engine. The technological change was that dramatic. Then, as so often happens, as we know these days, the classic boom and bust cycle kicked in. We had what was called then the Panic of 1837. It was a Great Depression, a great recession. Think Greece today. The banks failed. States defaulted on their loans. It was required for the United States Congress to pass our first bankruptcy laws. It was a terrible time. A young lawyer in Springfield, Illinois, who had just got admitted to the bar, found that his practice was dominated by collection cases. That was Abraham Lincoln. Politically, by 1820, the division within the United States was no longer big state against small state. Rather, it was free state against slave state. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 maintained that exact balance of free states and slave states by admitting Maine as a free state and Missouri as a slave state. Nat Turner's revolt in Virginia in 1831 and the abolition of slavery in its colonies by Great Britain deeply worried the Southerners. In the North, there was great agitation to move on to abolition. This is the photo of the American Anti-Slavery Society that was founded in 1833. The United States and the UK banned the international slave trade from Africa here in 1808. This action created a massive redistribution of slaves within the United States. They moved from the upper southeast, from Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, down to the new vast lands in the southwest to Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana. The price of a slave in Richmond was determined by the price of a slave in New Orleans. Typically, the slaves in Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, et cetera, were sold in the fall after they had brought in the harvest, and they were sent around to New Orleans so that they would arrive in New Orleans in the spring in time to work for the planting. It is no accident then that the third largest city in the United States was New Orleans, after New York and Baltimore. Now let's talk about the presidency. Martin Van Buren was president in 1837. He had a great resume. He was off to a good start, but then, as James Carville famously said, it's the economy stupid. And for his entire presidency, the Great Depression, the Panic of 1837 continued. So it was a horrible time to be president. The Whig convention in 1840 selected a war hero from Ohio as its presidential nominee, William Henry Harrison, famous for winning the Battle of Tippecanoe. They needed a Southerner to balance the ticket, so they selected John Tyler, who had been a senator and governor of Virginia. The election of 1840 was the first modern political campaign. Political slogans were used for the first time. Tippecanoe and Tyler too, you've heard. Van Buren was a Democrat from Kinderhook, New York, and OK clubs were formed, and that's how the term OK came into our national vocabulary. President Harrison had needless to say, Harrison won a huge majority in the Electoral College and became president. President Harrison had 6 cabinet members against 15 cabinet members today. The senior member, let me skip over that, was Daniel Webster as Secretary of State. He was the greatest lawyer at the time in the United States. He had argued 170 cases before the Supreme Court, a record never equaled since then. He had served in the House and the Senate, and he and Henry Clay founded the Whig Party in 1833. Webster worked hard with the president-elect to get Harrison to limit his enormous inaugural address. But it went on for 90 minutes in a snowstorm here in Washington on March 4th, 1841. Harrison caught a cold, got pneumonia, and the doctors bled him, fed him laudanum and brandy, and he died on April 4th. Secretary of State Webster sent his son, his own son Fletcher, on horseback down to Tyler's plantation in Virginia to announce that he was now the president. However, there was uncertainty about John Tyler's status. Was he acting president? Did he have full powers? This had never happened before. A president had never died in office. And he began to be viewed with suspicion by Whigs in the Congress. They fought over the national bank legislation. And in mid-September 1841, on a Saturday, 5 of the Whig cabinet members walked into the White House, and each one of them, 1 hour after the other, resigned. Daniel Webster stayed. Tyler wanted him to stay because he needed Webster to help him with battles with the Whigs in the Congress. And he was also worried about relations with Great Britain. And Tyler was an Anglophobe, and he knew that Daniel Webster was an Anglophile. Among other reasons, Daniel Webster, as a lawyer, had a wonderful client in the UK, Baring Brothers, the great financial house, which dominated European and American finances for years. And Daniel Webster was the American lawyer for Baring Brothers. In Congress, at that time, anti-slavery pressure was building and building. The Democrats controlled the House, and in 1836 adopted what was called the gag rule, that basically there's automatic tabling of any petition that relates to slavery in any way. The leader against the gag rule was John Quincy Adams, former president of the United States, who since 1831 was a member of the House. He fought against the gag rule over and over, and it was still in place in 1841 and 42. The Supreme Court. In 1839, African slaves violently revolted on a Spanish slave ship off Cuba, the Amistad. You all know the Amistad movie, the Spielberg movie in 1997. And those freed slaves ended up in the United States, and the Supreme Court had to decide the fate of those slaves. And the case was argued in February 1841. John Quincy Adams, the former president and now House member, argued the case for the slaves. It was his fifth and last appearance before the Supreme Court. In the movie, Anthony Hopkins played John Quincy Adams. In March, oh, that's the gag rule. I'm sorry, I should have showed you that. In March 1841, Justice Joseph Story wrote the opinion of the court which freed the slaves. It was a 7-1 opinion. This case, the Amistad case, did not involve the United States because the slaves were freed before they came to the United States. It was a Spanish ship, etc. But it was important for us in this discussion because it focused national attention on slavery and a mutinous revolt on a slave ship on the high seas, just what happened with the Creole. Now let's talk a little bit about British-US relationships. Great Britain at that time was the superpower of the world. For example, in purely military terms, Great Britain had 100 ships of the line. The United States had 15. Great Britain had colonies in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. It had naval bases in Malta and in Gibraltar. It had trading centers in Hong Kong, Canton, and Singapore. The Falklands became a crown colony in 1840, despite the American Monroe Doctrine. In 1839, the British invaded Afghanistan. And they came with more than 20,000 troops, and they had 30,000 camels to carry their supplies, including 300 cases of wine for the officers' mess. But the British were defeated in Afghanistan in 1841. There was a jihad against the British, amazing coincidences. They were defeated and they were massacred. 8,000 of the British forces were massacred as they retreated from Kabul at the Khyber Pass in January of 1842. This is important for the resolution of this mess. The United States saw the United Kingdom as a center of evil, fostering abolition, trying to undercut cotton prices by having a special relationship with the independent Republic of Texas, a great cotton producer. And they thought, the South anyway thought, the Brits really wanted to destroy the American economy. Remember, the War of 1812 was only a generation away when British Admiral Cockburn burned Washington, and every household in America remembered it. Those of you from Maryland, look at your license plates. It still says the War of 1812. But there were 4 specific problems in US-British relationships. First, in 1837, there was a rebellion in Canada. Some Americans went north to help the rebels. At the end of 1837, British militia crossed the Niagara and burned the American merchant ship, the Caroline, and pushed her over the Niagara Falls. Now imagine that. And Americans called for war against Great Britain. How could they do this to us? The British said, hey, self-defense. You Americans crossed the line and came up here, and we're okay doing that. The second problem was related. 3 years later, late in 1840, a deputy sheriff from Upper Canada, whose name was MacLeod, was passing through New York State. And stupidly, he starts bragging about his role in burning the Caroline and pushing it over the falls. Not surprisingly, New York State authorities arrested MacLeod and tried him for murder. The British said, MacLeod has no personal responsibility. He was part of our militia. Yeah, he was involved, but you can't go after him personally. This was a British activity. He was following orders. The British said, if MacLeod is found guilty, there will be war. End of story. Fortunately, in October 1841, about a month before the Creole entered the harbor at Nassau, a jury in New York State said MacLeod was not guilty. Whew. But the nerves were still tense. The third problem related to the Maine-Canadian border. Maine was separated from Massachusetts in 1820 as part of the Compromise of 1820. But its border, the Maine border with Canada, was never fairly or fully defined. And there were skirmishes. It's called the Aroostook War. The Maine legislature called the militia out. Other states passed resolutions. We'll send our militia to go after those awful people in Canada. It was sort of a barroom brawl. The fourth and last major problem between the US and Great Britain related to the naval presence off the coast of Africa, off the west coast of Africa. Both the British and the Americans had naval patrols off the coast of Africa to interdict illegal slaving. The British, rather freely, because they were the monster country, the great superpower, fairly freely boarded American ships to see if there was if they were really American, or were they some other kind, some pirates who just hoisted an American flag. For Americans who fought the War of 1812 in large part because of something like that, this was a serious problem. There were also lots of new faces between the two countries, with respect to the two countries, in 1841. In the UK, we had a new Prime Minister, Peel, and a new Foreign Secretary, Aberdeen. In the United States, we had the third American president in a single year. We had a new Secretary of State, a new ambassador to Great Britain, Edward Everett, who later became president of Harvard University, and much later gave that great 2-hour address in Gettysburg just before Lincoln gave his 2-hour Gettysburg address. The fact that everybody was new on both sides of the island caused obvious problems because there were no personal relationships and habits to smooth over the rough patches and to ease relationships. On the other hand, everything was new and ripe for, as we would say today, for a reset, as we did a couple of years ago with Russia. Just before, speaking of Britain, just before the Creole sailed from Richmond, heading out to the Atlantic, 29-year-old Charles Dickens, the most widely popular writer in the English-speaking world, wrote to his publisher and said, you know, I think in early 1842, I will go visit the United States. How about that? Now let's look very briefly at the British Bahamas. When the British Navy caught illegal slave ships after the banning of the international slave trade, These might be Spanish ships going to Cuba, Portuguese ships going to Brazil. They would bring them to the nearest British port, and free the Africans who had been captured as slaves. Many of those were brought to the Bahamas, to Nassau. And those free Africans now, once they stepped on British soil, retained their African languages, their culture, their religion. They lived in ethnic groups largely from Africa, the Yoruba, the Congos, the Igbos, Hausas, the Mandingos, etc. And in 1834, Britain gradually abolished slavery in most of their colonies, including the Bahamas, so that by 1838, all the slaves in the Bahamas were freed. Now, putting all this together, when the Creole entered the harbor in Nassau in November of 1841, you had a perfect storm. You had severe US-British tensions. You had a new president of uncertain status. They called him Your Excellency. Congress was all twisted in the gag rule. Anything that related to slavery was a tough sell. And in Nassau, a huge percentage of the population were recently freed African and local slaves. Now let's go back to November 9th, 1841 in Nassau. The first mate ran to the US consular officer, whose name was John Bacon, and reported what happened on the ship. Murder. These slaves rebelled and they sliced the head off. Oh, awful. Bacon, the US consular officer, went to see the Governor General of the Bahamas. The Governor General was Sir Francis Cockburn, who was a young British Army captain, had fought against the United States in Canada during the War of 1812. It was his older brother, Admiral Sir George Cockburn, who had authorized the burning of the White House in 1814, as the great historian Anthony Pitch would endorse. So needless to say, Cockburn, the Governor General of the Bahamas, did not have a great affection for the United States. The US Consul Bacon asked the Governor General, prevent these slaves from getting on shore, they're American property, take the 19 who were the murderers and put them in jail until we deal with them. Governor General Cockburn was noncommittal. But he sent a regiment of West Indian soldiers and 2 British magistrates on board the Creole, and pretty soon the soldiers took the 19 off and put them in jail. But from Hog Island came a huge flotilla of hundreds and hundreds of small boats, rowboats, little sailboats, and surrounded the Creole. And all those other slaves climbed overboard and got on them and moved into Nassau. They vanished. All the slaves, all 135 slaves except 5, left. 5 elected to stay on board. The US consular officer Bacon formally protested and demanded the return of the 19 slaves, but all those other slaves had vanished. On November 19th, the Creole sailed without its slaves to New Orleans, and without Captain Ensor. He was so severely injured that he had to stay in Nassau for a while. Governor Cockburn sought help urgently, advice from London, from Downing Street. It took a little while, but at the very end of January, London wrote back to Governor Cockburn and said, look, the 19 slaves charged with murder, they could be charged with murder, but since they're not British, and the ship is not British, and the murder didn't take place in British waters, they can't be tried in a British court here in Nassau. Now, the United States, they could try these guys, but the United States has no extradition treaty with Great Britain, so we can't turn them over. So on April 16th, the British freed those slaves that had been held in jail and they vanished, melted into Bahamian society. The Creole arrived in New Orleans on November 2nd. And needless to say, the city was in virtual flames over this. The Louisiana senators demanded war against Great Britain for taking all this American property and so on. South Carolina Senator Calhoun said this was the most outrageous action. We must go to war against Great Britain. In Congress, John Quincy Adams read a petition that war with England over the Creole slaves would be more unjust than England's war in 1776 to keep America in bondage. A petition was filed to formally censure John Quincy Adams, but it failed. 2 months later, Adams' protege, a young congressman from Ohio, Joshua Reed Giddings, he proposed a resolution dealing with the Creole issue. It was very clever. It was a long resolution, but the essence of it was this. There's no federal slavery. Slavery is a state matter. Okay. And you can hear the Southerners saying, good for you, Giddings. That's right, it's a state matter, states' rights, and the federal government can't tell us what to do. Okay, but he went on and said, but when a ship leaves a state and goes into international waters of the Atlantic, for example, the persons on board are no longer subject to the slave laws of that state. And therefore, when the Creole left Virginia had no more jurisdiction over those slaves, and the persons on board simply returned to their natural rights, and they're not liable to any punishment. What Giddings was doing, very clever, Giddings was making an indirect attack on the coastwise slave trade, using the Creole as an example. Remember I said the biggest thing in slavery at that point was moving this mass redistribution of slaves from the upper South around to the Southwest, and he was going after that. It's a short fuse for everybody. The next day, the House of Representatives voted overwhelmingly, formally, to censure Joshua Reed Giddings. It was only the second time in American history that a member of Congress was censured. He got out of his desk on the House floor, walked down to John Quincy Adams' desk, shook his hands, and left the House, said goodbye formally to the Speaker, etc. Went back to Ashtabula, Ohio, and within weeks he was overwhelmingly reelected and came back to Congress. Quite a story. In May, word reached Washington that the British had freed those murderous slaves from jail, and the South went berserk. A little leitmotif for a moment. Remember I mentioned Charles Dickens saying at the end of 1841 that he might visit the United States? Well, he did. He arrived in Boston in late January. And he was subject, and this was a rock star at that time. He had dinners with everybody, every famous person. In Philadelphia, in New York, he met with former President Van Buren. In Philadelphia, he met with Edgar Allan Poe. He came to Washington in March and was invited for private dinners at the White House. Up at the Congress, he met Webster and Tyler and Calhoun and Adams and everybody else, Washington Irving. And he was about to head south because his plan was to start in Boston and come all the way south. And Henry Clay took him aside and said, my boy, over this Creole thing, the South hates the British. I don't think it would be safe for you to go down there. So Charles Dickens got the message and went west. So if you read his book that he wrote about this period called The American Notes, it's all about his time in the very north and then in the west. And by the way, he only praised in his book 2 Americans, John Quincy Adams, Joshua Reed Giddings. Okay, so we have this mess, and enter diplomacy. Christmas Eve, 1841, Prime Minister Peel meets very young Queen Elizabeth and says, a third war with the United States is on the horizon. And she said, oh my God, what can we do? Remember Afghanistan in the back of your minds, if you're British? Prime Minister Peel said, I have an idea. I propose a special mission, and I think you ought to nominate Alexander Baring of Baring Brothers, Lord Ashburton, to come to the United States and represent Great Britain with full powers to do whatever he wants to settle all of these issues, borders and the Caroline and everything else. So she said, that's a good deal, we'll do it. Now, Alexander Baring, as I said, Lord Ashburton, and Daniel Webster were client and lawyer for years. 3 years before, Webster had come over to the UK, stayed in Lord Ashburton's mansions, was invited to balls, met the Queen, etc. He arrived in Annapolis in early April. The Queen had wanted him to deliver the message that this is Great Britain these stupid Americans are dealing with, and so she wanted to emphasize its strength. So she sent him on a frigate that was so large it needed a crew of 500 to manage it. The Americans got the message. He brought with him servants, he brought carriages, horses, wine, you name it. Ashburton had asked Webster, help me with housing, where should I live during this time? Daniel Webster, who lived right at Lafayette Park in a space that is now the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, said, right 100 yards from me is a brand new, wonderful house, and you ought to lease that. That is now the parish house for St. John's Episcopal Church. If you walk past it, you'll see a little sign out front saying Ashburton House. It was convenient, although ironically it was about 50 feet from Dolly Madison's house. And you recall Dolly Madison was the first lady who had to escape the White House after the British burned them. The State Department was right next to the White House. It was a tiny little operation. Ashburton and Webster negotiated and negotiated. They had lavish dinners at Ashburton House. And by the end of June, Ashburton wrote to Lord Aberdeen that this problem of the Creole, unless we resolve it somehow, is going to sink all of these other issues that we have to deal with. Finally, Webster and Ashburton put together in treaty form all of the issues except the Creole. They agreed, for example, Ashburton, Webster, and President Tyler used secret funds, slush money, to soften up people in Maine and people on the Canadian side to agree to a new border. We will define the border. The Americans got a little bit more than half, so that was a good deal. So they settled the border. That was in the treaty. On the issue of the right to search American vessels off the African coast for slavers, they had a nice resolution. Let's do joint patrols, so one doesn't have to board the other. We'll be doing it together. They agreed to an extradition treaty. Webster tried to get a provision in there that one of the extraditable offenses would be a revolt on board a ship. But Ashburton was too smart to be caught by that, and he said, I know you're talking about the Creole, so we're not going to do that. By mid-July, they exchanged notes about the Caroline affair going over Niagara Falls, in which Ashburton admitted that the British had violated U.S. territory, but he never offered compensation and never formally accepted responsibility. So all of the issues, all of the tough issues got settled, except for the Creole affair. Can you imagine Webster and Ashburton in this kind of weather in Washington in August, without air conditioning, trying to deal with this? Finally, they agreed an exchange of notes. Webster's notes of August 1st was a long lawyer's brief on the Creole matter, beginning by saying, now I understand, Lord Ashburton, that you are not empowered to deal with the Creole issue. But then he went on and explained all about the US position on it. And twice he used the term officious interference. That was Governor Coburn's activities that he didn't like. And he stressed the importance of UK-US trade, the cotton trade, et cetera. And he asked Lord Ashburton, you know your government's policy, and surely you can give instructions that there will be no British conduct that would be out of conformity with the rights and positions of the American government. Look for the future. Ashburton responded on August 6th and said, I'm not empowered to deal with this Creole matter, but I can engage, quote, that instructions shall be given to the governors in the colonies on the southern borders of the United States that there shall be no officious interference with American vessels driven there by accident or violence into those ports. Today we would call this constructive ambiguity. That's the famous term that Henry Kissinger used at the Shanghai Communique when Nixon opened China. Constructive ambiguity dealing with Taiwan. So the logjam was broken. They signed the Treaty of Washington on August 9th. It settled the boundary and extradition and all these things, and it was sent up to the Senate for ratification. It was ratified on a Saturday immediately with the largest majority of any Senate ratification of a treaty until then. So it's all done. Now let me mention quickly 3 epilogue events. One was an insurance case. When the Creole arrived in New Orleans in December of 1841, the slave owners who had been smart enough, as had been their practice, to have taken out insurance on their property. Everybody has property insurance. Their property happened to be human. And so they filed claims against their insurance companies for compensation. In the lower courts, the slave owners won, but the insurance companies appealed. The lawyer for the insurance companies was a young Louisiana lawyer called Judah Benjamin. And I'll come back to him if we have time later on, an extraordinary figure. He was the lawyer for the insurance companies. He began by attacking the slave owners, saying, look, the Creole wasn't seaworthy, its crew wasn't armed, you didn't frisk the slaves, it's all your fault. The ultimate question was whether the loss of property was due to the British authorities, which was covered by the policy, or due to an insurrection by the slaves, which was not covered by the policy. The decision came out in March of 1845. It's an amazing document. It's 150 pages, parts in Latin, parts in French, parts in English. And the court said that the slave insurrection caused the loss. Therefore, the insurance companies weren't liable, and the slave owners were not compensated for their loss. I should have added that the lawyer, Judah Benjamin, happened to have owned 140 slaves at that point. The second epilogue is an arbitration that took place in London in January 1855. The United States and Great Britain had a treaty to settle all claims between their two countries. An international arbitration panel decided then that the Creole had a right to seek help because it was in distress. The British had an obligation to keep the slaves until they could be sent to the United States, and an obligation to save the other slaves. Therefore, the UK violated international law, and the United Kingdom had to pay the United States about $850 per slave to the American slave owners. That's about $20,000 a slave in today's terms. The last epilogue is a book. Oh, Judah Benjamin, I'm sorry, I should have shown him. And we must talk about him if we have time. The early 1850s was a great time for abolitionist literature. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Solomon Northup wrote 12 Years a Slave. Remember the picture that last year won the Academy Awards for the Best Picture. And at the same year, Frederick Douglass wrote his only work of fiction called The Heroic Slave, Madison, Washington. This was his only work of fiction, and if it had been set to music, it would have been a Puccini opera, La Bohème. It was just dramatic. It's mostly the backstory of Madison, Washington that he made up. But it deals with Washington's escape from slavery in Virginia. He makes it to Ohio, where a white family helps him and helps him move on to Canada and to freedom, which was a crime to assist a fugitive slave. But he returned to Virginia, and he's caught, and he's put on the Creole, and he personally sails the Creole into Nassau Harbor and wins. The message was Virginia was great for the revolution. It had great ideals, but that Virginia is dying. And the new state with the proper ideals is Ohio, which happened to be the home of Harriet Beecher Stowe and Joshua Reed Giddings. His other message was to slaves, right is on your side, and your leaders are worthy. Madison, Washington is a worthy leader. And to the whites in the United States, have courage to follow the nation's basic principles and to help slaves lead themselves to freedom, as he did. Whatever happened to Madison, Washington? Well, in April of 1842, when he stepped out of the jail in Nassau, he stepped out of history. We have no idea what happened to him. Let me take one other moment, because I have been remiss in failing to express appreciation to the National Archives here and in the regional center in El Paso, Texas, because they found for me the manifest. Sorry, I don't have a photo for there, but it's in the book. The manifest of the Creole, which shows Madison, Washington at age 25, 5'9", et cetera. It's a remarkable document, and the archives has just done a marvelous job in trying to put things together. Well, that's the story. Thank you for listening, and I will welcome. I'll welcome any questions, for which please move to the microphones, I'm told. While we're waiting, I'll show. Or I guess I'm not going to show. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I have a question about, you mentioned that of the 19, there was a gun, and maybe it's in your book. It sounds like there was some type of investigation that was done to find that there were 19, that there was a gun, that there was all this information, that people would have had to been interviewed, both sides, I assume. So anything that you can talk about from that perspective and what that might have led to, because slavery was still in place, to prevent something like that from happening again.
Sure. There was a gun and there were knives, and then the officer and crew had some weapons on board that never fired. They misfired, they didn't have ammunition, et cetera. But somehow the slaves had smuggled on some weapons. In the Frederick Douglass book, The Heroic Slave, his white friend from Ohio meets him just before he gets on the Creole and slips him 3 knives. But we don't know exactly how these slaves acquired weapons, but they had them, and they overpowered the crew immediately. And after the settlement with the British, there were no more incidents like this. Now, I'm sure, I can't prove this, but I'm sure that the maritime authorities and the slavers, the slave owners, made sure that all the slaves were checked before they got on board, and there might have been armed guards that paid attention too. So there was no more incident like this. Yes, ma'am.
Yes. When you attended law school, was this case covered, or is it something you researched on your own?
Oh no, this is rarely covered. You can ask historians of the period, what do you know about the Creole? Nobody knows about it. It's an amazing story, but it's not taught anywhere. And I should add, on your question about the investigation, when the British authorities in Nassau came on board, one set of those authorities were magistrates, and they interviewed everybody on board. And it was their report from interviewing the slaves and the officers and the crew and Captain Ensor's wife and so on, that they narrowed it down to these 19. And actually 2 died in prison from natural causes, so there were, in the end, 17 were freed. And then for this insurance case in Louisiana, all kinds of authorities came to Louisiana for the discussion. The consular officer, Bacon, came to New Orleans. So everybody was testifying on what happened. And the facts were not clear. There were 2 different stories, essentially. The Americans, the shippers, were saying, these awful British, they let these guys go, this is terrible. And the British were saying, come on. The ship's officers and crew didn't want to sail back with all these slaves on board because they were afraid of getting killed. So there's a real discrepancy in exactly what happened. Nobody knew.
In the 1855 arbitration,
Excuse me, I was asked to ask you, or perhaps I can just repeat the question. Oh, there you are.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
yeah, in the 1855 arbitration, where the British were ordered to pay, did they in fact pay the compensation they were ordered to pay?
Oh, yes. Yeah, it was a 3-member team, which is typical for a claim settlement negotiation. And the umpire, he's called, the third guy, the deciding guy, was actually an American citizen, but who lived in London, and guess who he worked for? Baring Brothers. He was a commercial guy, and I think that probably influenced him a bit, because if you're a commercial guy involved in international trade, you don't want funny things like this to happen. You want order and predictability. But anyway, yes, they paid. And there was actually a subsequent dispute that ended up in the US Supreme Court because the slave owners had hired a Washington lobbyist to prosecute their claim with the British. And the Washington lobbyists wanted a piece of the settlement that the British made, and they fought it through the Supreme Court. It was just ridiculous, but it went on. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Downey, for that lovely speech. It reminds me of the Trent Affair in Abraham Lincoln's time, when they almost came to war. 2 Confederates were captured off the coast of Cuba by the Union Army, Navy, and Lincoln gave Seward, his Secretary of State, the opportunity to argue for it and Lincoln against. And Lincoln said, I cannot have 2 wars at one time. And I wondered whether you might have, because you were talking about the brink of war, whether you mentioned this at all of Trent Affair.
Thank you. Yes, I mentioned the Trent Affair in passing. The most interesting part, in a way, is that the key Confederate who was captured on the Trent as it was heading for England was Slidell, who happened to be the law partner in New Orleans of Judah Benjamin. And so ironically, you had that linkage. Judah Benjamin, by the way, went on to be a United States senator, and then was a senior officer in the Confederacy. His picture is on the Confederate $2 bill, and he was Confederate Secretary of State, Secretary of War, and Attorney General. When the war ended, when the Civil War ended, He beat it south and got out, made his way to, of all places, Nassau, the Bahamas, and then made his way to Liverpool and the United Kingdom, where he became the most successful English lawyer in English history. And he wrote a famous book, a law book on sales. And if you ask a British solicitor today, do you know Benjamin on Sales? That's the title of the book. That's, oh, sure, every law student reads Benjamin on Sales. But nobody knows that he was an American who represented the slave owners, the insurance companies in the Louisiana case, and was the law partner of Slidell, who was caught in the Trent affair. Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you.
Folks, as we said earlier, don't forget there's a book signing one level up in the Archives bookstore. We'll see you up there in just a couple minutes.